Honourable members, I wish to inform honourable members that I received 5 written notices of motion and they are as follows. A draft motion to congratulate His Excellency Honourable Bethel Amadi from Honourable Martin Bohe. Second, draft motion to establish a caucus for former PAP members of Parliament from the Honourable Saleh Kabzabo. The third is a draft motion to support the government and people of Kenya in combating terrorism from the Honourable Rachel Shebesh. A draft motion on the rotation of the presidency of the Pan-African Parliament from the Honourable Vinita Kailan. And a draft motion urging the Pan-African Parliament to play an active role in spearheading the implementation of Beyond 2015 Strategic Development Goals from Honourable Rachel Shebesh. The motions were submitted in accordance with the provisions of our Rules of Procedure 60 and 61, and we have therefore placed the motions on the other paper of today, Thursday, 21st May 2015, in the afternoon. Honourable members, we have in our midst today a very august visitor and special guest. In accordance with provisions of Rule 838(1)H, it is with great pleasure that I now invite His Excellency Thabo Mbeki, former President of the Republic of South Africa and Chairperson of the African Union High-Level Panel on Illicit Financial Flows from Africa, to please enter the chamber. Please be seated. Honourable members, may I now invite the Clerk of Parliament to read the first order of the day.
Thank you, Mr. President. Presentation and debate on the report of the African Union High-Level Panel on illicit financial flows from Africa.
Members of the Bureau, my colleagues, honourable members of Parliament, distinguished ladies and gentlemen in the gallery, today is a very special day for us at the Pan-African Parliament, and we have the honor and pleasure to have in our midst an elder statesman and a foremost Pan-Africanist. We have today the opportunity and privilege to drink from his fountain of wisdom and knowledge. Join me as I call upon His Excellency President Thabo Mbeki, former President of the Republic of South Africa and Chairperson of the African Union High-Level Panel on Illicit Financial Flows from Africa, to please come to the podium and address this august House.
Thank you very much, Honorable President, and Honorable President and Vice Presidents of the Pan-African Parliament, and Honorable Members, ladies and gentlemen. I must say, President, as you saw, I got two of my colleagues here sitting here, Yemi and Mujanku, who constituted our secretariat for the panel. I'm introducing them, President, in the event that afterwards anybody, members of the Parliament, asks a difficult question, they will answer it. But would like to thank you for inviting us to share some thoughts with you about the illicit outflows of capital from Africa. In 2011, the African Ministers of Finance, of Planning and Economic Development, jointly convened by the African Union and the UN Economic Commission for Africa, identified these illicit capital outflows as constituting a major obstacle to our development efforts. And accordingly, they decided to form a high-level panel to investigate and make recommendations about what Africa should do to stop these illicit financial outflows. The panel, which I had the privilege to chair, started its work in 2012 and submitted its report to the 24th Ordinary Session of the Assembly of African Union Heads of State and Government this January. And the Assembly adopted the report and its recommendations. By way of background, it is estimated that over the last 50 years, Africa has lost in excess of $1 trillion in illicit financial outflows. And our panel further estimated that our continent loses annually over $50 billion through these illicit outflows. And we must explain that this estimate is based on data obtained from the International Monetary Fund Direction of Trade Statistics, which, as Raymond Baker, Director of the Global Financial Integrity, explains, report annual exports and imports for all pairs of reporting countries. And therefore, the figure of 50 billion is an underestimate, as it excludes such elements as trade in services and intangibles, proceeds of bribery and trafficking in drugs, people, and firearms. But as we have said, the African ministers decided to investigate the matter of these outflows because of the immense development challenges which face the continent. And for us to meet these challenges requires huge volumes of capital. And accordingly, it does not make any sense that we should be exporting capital which should be retained within the continent. You will recall that later this year, the Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs adopted in the year 2000, will be replaced by the new Sustainable Development Goals. And in this regard, you know that many of our African countries did not achieve all of these MDGs because of insufficient capital to finance the required actions. And you'll also recall that to address this challenge, the challenge of generating the resources to enable all countries to realize the MDGs, in 2002, the UN convened the International Conference on Financing for Development. And as you know, the next International Conference on Financing for Development will be held in Addis Ababa in July this year. It is clear that this time round, the conference will pay particular attention to the matter of domestic resource mobilization to finance the new development goals. Indeed, in its declaration on illicit financial flows, the African Union Assembly in January expressed the need to ensure that the illicit financial flows and their impact on domestic resource mobilization is given the necessary attention by the Third International Conference on Financing for Development, and in this regard it stressed the need for robust international cooperation to address the problem. It is therefore obvious that particular attention will be paid to the issue of stemming the illicit financial outflows throughout the developing world. And this will put pressure on all of us to act on this matter. In this context, I should say we should again take particular note of the observation made by the AU Assembly in that declaration on illicit financial flows concerning, quote, the growing need for domestic resource mobilization for the attainment of our continental development visions and goals, particularly Agenda 2063, and the Common African Position on the post-2015 development agenda, which both call for inclusive growth, sustainable development, and social and economic structural transformation of Africa through optimal utilization of our natural resource endowments. In the context of everything I've said, it's necessary to keep in mind the various specifics of our situation as Africans. The United Nations has estimated that the number of Africans living on less than $1.25 a day increased from 290 million people in 1990 to 414 million in 2010. And it says that in addition, per capita GDP in Africa is 1/5, that is 20% of the global average figure. And in 2012, the gross capital formation rates in Nigeria and South Africa were 13% and 19% respectively. That's 13% and 90% of GDP. And the related figures for China and India were 49% and 35%, as opposed to 13% and 19%. And yet the African Development Bank and others estimate that Africa needs an additional $30 to $50 billion annually to address its infrastructure needs. These statistics, Mr. President, make the unequivocal statement that Africa needs large volumes of capital effectively to address the challenge of the eradication of poverty and underdevelopment. And it is precisely in this context that the imperative stands out that everything should be done to stop the illicit financial outflows which contribute so much to depleting the capital our continent so urgently needs. And accordingly, to indicate what needs to be done, our panel on illicit financial flows adopted the self-explanatory action slogan, track it, stop it, get it. And of central importance in this regard is the finding of our panel, the finding that our panel made, that the bulk of illicit financial flows from our continent, that is 60% or more, derives from the activities of the large commercial companies. The second and third sources of these illicit outflows, respectively, are through criminal activities, such as drug trafficking, accounting for about 30%, and lastly, corruption. And with regard to the latter matter, we must explain that here corruption features in two contexts. One of these, which we have just mentioned, is the expatriation of corruptly acquired resources. And the second is corruption understood as the abuse of entrusted power to facilitate the illicit export of capital by others, and therefore its prevalence throughout the various activities which represent the illicit outflows. And the second important finding we must mention is that the outflows from Africa end up somewhere else in the world. Accordingly, to stem these outflows requires cooperation and joint action among the originating and the receiving countries. And I'd like to make two observations in this regard. One of these is that the various tax havens and the financial secrecy jurisdictions in Africa and elsewhere in the world are at the center of the problem of illicit financial outflows, since they are among the major receiving countries for these outflows. And this calls for concerted international action to address this challenge, since it is clear that transparency in terms of financial transactions is indeed key. It's key to achieving success in the fight against the illicit outflows. And our second observation is that as yet there is no global architecture to ensure the required concerted global action to combat the illicit financial outflows. In this regard, even as our panel says that, and I quote, that there are a large number of commendable initiatives and instruments which it lists to deal with the commercial, criminal, and corrupt activities of the international financial, illicit financial flows, which it says are nevertheless disparate and handled in separate processes and forums. It suggests that it would be best that the matter of the illicit financial outflows is dealt with comprehensively under the auspices of the United Nations. Yet another important finding of our panel is that many of the African countries lack the capacity to combat these illicit flows and makes various recommendations in this regard. And I'll come back to that. And another finding we must mention relates to the matter of the unwise use of tax incentives to attract foreign direct investment. And in this regard, the panel stated that, and I quote, in many instances, these policy decisions to grant the tax incentives are not guided by proper cost-benefit analyses, but rather by the intention of outdoing competitors for foreign direct investment, with the intention of outdoing these competitors for foreign direct investment, leading to harmful tax competition and a race to the bottom. And the second last finding we would like to mention concerns the important matter of corruption. And in this regard, the panel said, and I quote again, corruption remains a matter of major concern despite the global and regional attention that resulted in the adoption of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption and the African Union Convention on Preventing and Combating Corruption. And the panel said that corruption is a cross-cutting and integral part of the illicit financial flows because of its facilitating role. Corruption in the form of abuse of entrusted power for private benefit in both the public and private sectors thus remains an issue of continuing concern, unquote. And the last finding we'd like to mention relates to the need to expedite the processes of asset recovery and repatriation. And in this regard, the panel drew attention to the importance of the United Nations, the UN and the AU conventions against corruption, which we've just mentioned, as well as the Stolen Assets Recovery Initiative, which is a partnership between the World Bank and the UN Office on Drugs and Crime and the Asset Recovery Interagency Network of Southern Africa. With your permission, Mr. President, I'd like to elaborate a little more on some of the panel findings I've mentioned by quoting some paragraphs from the panel report. And this will relate to the matter of the corporations, the companies, the tax incentives, and the issue of the capacity of our countries to fight against the illicit financial outflows. And the panel report says that the commercial sector is a major source of illicit financial outflows in Africa, but it is the least understood. And this is due to the range of methods by which the illicit financial flows take place in the commercial sector, as well as the technicality of issues such as transfer pricing, tax evasion, aggressive tax avoidance, trade misinvoicing, tax incentives, double taxation agreements, and the like. And it said, although the OECD is working to address issues of base erosion and profit sharing, this work is not principally geared to developing country concerns. That African governments are concerned about the negative impact of these illicit financial outflows on their tax revenues and investment capital. But most of them lack legislation and guidelines on transfer pricing or effective units to address the problem. And the report went on to say African countries need to pay closer attention to the illicit flows from the commercial sector. This means developing the required capacities, establishing or strengthening necessary institutions, including transfer pricing units, and providing resources for the effective functioning of these institutions. It would also mean holding multinationals accountable for fraudulent practices by setting up requirements for their transfer of funds and their business practices. And with regard to the matter of tax incentives, and the report says that there is a clear need to undertake cost-benefit analysis in granting tax incentives, especially tax holidays intended to attract foreign direct investment. And moreover, there should be coordination of such incentives among regional economic communities to develop common standards and prevent a race to the bottom. And it says for tax holidays, rules should be drawn up to prevent the same entity or beneficial owner from continuing to benefit after there is an apparently substantial change in ownership. And concerning the issue of capacity, the report states that the ability of African countries to combat the illicit financial flows is seriously impeded by deficiencies in their capacities to track, to stop and repatriate illicit financial outflows. And this lack of capacity is reflected at various levels, such as the lack of accurate data and up-to-date information, inadequate understanding of the various mechanisms used, and absent or ineffective legislative, regulatory, and institutional frameworks. And it says most African countries do not have enough highly trained lawyers, accountants, and tax experts to carry out the oversight functions to prevent or punish perpetrators of illicit financial outflows. The few that exist are often overworked and unable to prepare sufficiently to take on top-class professionals representing the large corporations. And illicit financial outflows from Africa can be reduced and stemmed only by enhancing and improving relevant capacities across the board. And this requires a dedicated and upscaled effort to provide resources. It means providing money to create relevant agencies, such as the revenue authorities, transfer pricing units, customs services, the anti-corruption agencies, financial intelligence units, and the like, where these do not exist. It also means strengthening the existing institutions by giving them the necessary autonomy and tools with which to carry out their duties. It further means recruiting and training top-flight personnel and making efforts to retain them in the public sector. And regional efforts are also needed, including through such forums as the African Tax Administration Forum and related mutual assistance programs. And it says that the support of the global community is also essential to make up the current capacity deficiencies. The idea of tax inspectors without borders is a good example of how such support could be rendered. And Mr. President and honorable members, I have just quoted some paragraphs which relate to only three out of the 15 findings in the panel report. Nevertheless, these paragraphs are sufficient to indicate the extent of the detailed work we as Africans have to do effectively to arrest the illicit capital outflows from our continent. I would therefore urge that you study the report of the panel, the better to empower yourselves correctly to determine what you should do as the elected representatives of our people to help implement the recommendations of the panel. Further, I would also suggest that you study the important African Union Assembly Declaration on illicit financial flows, especially the actions that should be taken to stem these outflows. As an example, Honorable President, the Assembly of the AU resolved to, quote, request the AU Commission, the Economic Commission for Africa, the African Development Bank, the African Capacity Building Foundation, and other development partners to build capacities of African Union member states and institutions, particularly in contract negotiation, tax management, regulatory and legal frameworks, money laundering, asset recovery and repatriation, and resource governance for effective and optimal management and governance of our natural resources. The Assembly also urged that carrying out of advocacy work to disseminate the panel's findings and to galvanize support from a broad coalition of partners, including civil society and the private sector, to implement the panel's recommendations was necessary. Obviously, Honorable President, the Pan-African Parliament will have to define its own specific role and the practical work it will do to implement these and the other actions to help ensure that we stem and stop the illicit capital outflows which impact so negatively on the continental development efforts. I'd like to conclude by quoting yet another paragraph from the Declaration of the AU Assembly. Our heads of state and government said that they are aware that the problem of illicit financial flows is exacerbated by corrupt tendencies of government agencies, by lack of or weak African institutions both at national and continental levels in all sectors, governance challenges, political instability and conflicts, weak tax administrations, and lack of capacity to monitor and curb such criminal activities, among others. Unquote. I think, Honorable President, this further clarifies the areas on which you and our elected representatives need to focus to retain within our continent the valuable resources that will help us to achieve the better life for the billion Africans to which all of us are committed. We are therefore confident, Honorable President, that the Pan-African Parliament will indeed respond energetically to the call to track it, to stop it, and to get it. I thank you very much for your attention.
Honourable members, please give another round of applause to His Excellency. For that wonderful presentation.